I published a piece last week called Every Startup is a Headquarters. And I want to go deeper on something that I don't feel like I could fully unpack in writing. The piece was based off of a quote from Jim Erickson, who's the director of strategic initiatives at the Economic Development Corporation of Kansas City. He was here appearing at an event and he was on stage talking about kind of the economic development strategy related to entrepreneurship. And he made that statement of we need to be thinking about every startup as a headquarters. So the essay that I wrote really made the economic case, the new jobs, wage premiums, and something called the Moretti principle, which talks about the number of jobs that are created from every innovation economy job that is created. And one element of the essay was this idea that attraction is a key element of that equation. But the data alone doesn't capture the distinction that I think it's important we make here. So I want to go a little deeper on a specific element of this idea, the idea of the key difference as it relates to infrastructure from the small business versus the high growth entrepreneurship aspects of this. The data tells you that high growth entrepreneurship matters. It doesn't tell you why we keep failing to build infrastructure for it. And that's really what I wanted to talk about today. Um, this is not when we talk about the difference between, the distinction between small business and high growth entrepreneurship. It's not about ambition or quality. It's not about one being better than the other. This is a structural issue. And so, what I mean by that, there's a couple elements. The first one is from an economic perspective. Small businesses are built to serve local economic circulation. They do a great job when you have restaurants and barbershops and retail locations. They do a great job of keeping money in a local economy. They oftentimes provide essential services for the community. And honestly, small business is the fabric of our neighborhoods and our communities. They serve an incredibly important economic element to what we do when we do community development. Five jobs that are created through restaurants or barbershops or law firms, those are five jobs that are created from local demand. And that's extremely important. So I don't want to minimize or diminish the economic uh, emphasis or the economic importance of small business in our communities. High growth entrepreneurship, on the other hand, serves economic expansion. These are businesses that create new economic activity that didn't previously exist in the region. When a high growth company hires 50 people, they're typically net new employment, net new economic opportunities to that community. And as Moretti's research shows, and what was highlighted in the essay was each of those jobs that's created generates five more across other sectors. And those are extremely important because it's not just five different jobs. Three of those jobs, based on the research, don't require college degrees. So you have this impact, this ripple effect from an economic perspective, where small business really promotes holding money in a community, which is extremely important to the health of community. And then you have high growth entrepreneurship that brings money in and creates that economic expansion, but yet the jobs that created, the ripple effect jobs that are created by those opportunities impact all of these local demand sectors. So the reason that people, in my opinion, the reason that people get hung up on it is that we've conflated two things. We've conflated the social value of entrepreneurship, which is the ability for it to create independence, self-determination, community building, with the economic function of entrepreneurship, which is that job creation velocity, the wage premium aspects where you get kind of a 100% increase for innovation economy jobs or a 50% increase over the national standard, the GDP contribution, and those multiplier effects. We've conflated these two issues. So when you have an elected official that says we support small business, they're speaking to the social value and they're right. But when an economic development strategy only supports small business, it's optimizing the circulation and leaving expansion on the table. the risk profile difference is also there. Small businesses and small business entrepreneurship is typically a self-funded activity or debt-funded activity. It's not designed typically for steady state operation and optimized to avoid failure. Whereas high growth entrepreneurship, the risk profile is typically an equity funded approach at capital. It's designed for rapid scaling and structurally tends to accept a higher failure rate in exchange for these outsized outcomes when it works. This is when we talk about the power law when it comes to venture finance. You have to make 10 bets, hoping that one of them is a home run. You don't take that kind of calculated risk when you're talking about small business infrastructure within a community. And the difference in this risk architecture is why that same infrastructure can't serve both. An SBA loan and an angel investment aren't different sizes of the same thing. They're structurally different instruments for very different economic functions and outcomes. And so a neighborhood restaurant and a venture-backed software company are both entrepreneurship, without a doubt, but they're just not the same thing. They don't need the same capital. They don't need the same type of mentorship, and they certainly don't create the same economic effect, both of which are beneficial to communities. And when we treat them as one category, we tend to underserve both of them. So we talk about entrepreneurship as one thing, we fund it as one thing, we measure it as one thing, and it just isn't one thing. So what I want to do now is shift to, why do I think regions miss this? And there's a political reality associated with this. Small business is universally understood and very popular. And high growth entrepreneurship, honestly, sounds elitist if it's framed wrong. And usually that's a political issue. So a city with 500 new small businesses and zero high growth companies looks great on a dashboard and stagnates economically. The metric feels productive, but the outcome truly isn't when it comes to the economic health of a region. And honestly, infrastructure for small business is traditionally easier to build. The ability to establish SBA loans and micro lending, even the newer elements of micro lending, the ability to stand up, kind of SBDC advising and workshops, the ability to support some of the repeatable elements of, understanding how small business operates, because many of them are just different versions of ones that are created in different communities. Whereas high growth entrepreneurship needs a different capital stack. The risk capital is different. It needs deeper networks of industry expertise and knowledge. It creates and needs corporate connectivity and corporate pathways and is supported by greater density. So it's harder and it's more expensive to design in many ways. And honestly, I watched this happen in corporate. My time at Sprint, I watched this happen for 20 years. The safe bets always won the budget. The transformational ones always had to fight for oxygen. And the regions, I think, make the same mistake. They fund what's easy to measure and they underinvest in what actually moves the needle, especially for economic growth across a region. So now I want to talk about, like, what does designing for the difference actually look like? And honestly, when you think about what happens when you design for one thing, we tend to um, we tend to group things into these categories. And for high growth entrepreneurship, we tend to focus on two areas, and everyone gravitates towards them, and we oftentimes lose their effectiveness. And so there are five, we'll call them stages of design related to high growth entrepreneurship. And I want to walk you through each one of those very briefly. I want to talk about this in a deeper level in another episode at some point in time. But right now, I just want to kind of walk you through these five stages of design and how each one of them is structured differently for high growth entrepreneurship. And then specifically, I think regions tend to get two of the five. Uh, I don't even want to say right. They tend to focus on two of the five, and three of them are missing. And so the first one is this idea of pre-venture, right? The exposure layer. And this is, how do we have people who are more exposed, being exposed to entrepreneurship in a meaningful way, seeing it happen. We talk about representation matters when it comes to elements of inclusion and diversity. Representation matters when it comes to entrepreneurship. If a region doesn't have a history of entrepreneurship, you tend not to see more entrepreneurs popping out of that region and from that local economy. And so we need these opportunities for the narratives and the exposure and the lessons learned and watching others do it. Those are important elements. And that's, this pre-venture stage when someone's really trying to determine whether they want to be an entrepreneur or not is something that oftentimes when you build around that from an ecosystem perspective, the criticism comes that that's not really supporting growth. But without this pre-venture layer, this exposure layer, none of the rest of it really comes to fruition. This is where the seeds are laid within a regional economy. The second design phase, if you will, or design stage, is the idea of moving from ideation to validation. And this is, what we would call the scaffolding layer. This is where you determine, is the problem real? Is anyone willing to pay for it? Can I build a team capable of executing on it? We often see entrepreneurs who talk about, the problems and then the solutions, but we fail to build that scaffolding layer to really help understand, is value being created that can sustain a high growth business, a fundable high growth opportunity that can scale employees, scale revenue, and ultimately lead to the financial outcomes that investors want to see leveraged. And that is surrounding entrepreneurs who are asking these questions, asking if they're surrounded by entrepreneurs that have done it before, if they're surrounded by people who can really talk to them about how customer validation happens and provide them with the structure, the experience, the tools to really get to, those customer conversations and that real element of understanding if that business is something that can be done. The third design phase is the validation to product market fit. And this is kind of that capital and density layer. This is, I think a lot of us in this space refer to this as the messy middle, right? This is pre-seed capital, seed capital, micro venture capital. And this is where physical density starts to matter, where fellowship and being able to be in and around the networks, in and around the other entrepreneurs that are experiencing and undertaking the same type of activities. This is the layer where you really start to see companies get built once they go from validation to this product market fit. And the capital, we hear investors oftentimes talk about the questions that a startup, a founder still needs to answer before they're ready to scale, before they're ready to grow, before they're ready to get institutional capital or the money that wants to see those, 10x kind of impacts and outcomes. But we don't fund them to answer those questions. This is a riskier part of the infrastructure that definitely doesn't look like small business. And it's one that we oftentimes miss and most regions lack when it comes to the infrastructure and what needs to be designed. The fourth one is the product market fit to scale side. This is the acceleration layer. This is where, when we talk about designing for high growth entrepreneurship, where most regions build infrastructure around this. These are accelerators. These are pitch competitions. This is what we recognize when we talk about high growth entrepreneurship today. And this is one that we have everything in this layer, in this fourth level, but we don't have any of the pieces that fit before it. Maybe the early stage, the very, very early stage part, that I described as that pre-venture exposure layer. But we skip the ideation to validation. We skip the validation to product market fit. We don't build the things that support that piece. We just focus on this product market to scale, product market fit to scale kind of layer, that acceleration layer. And if you don't have what comes before and you don't have this next one, the fifth one, and you don't have what comes after it, you really lack the required infrastructure to support high growth entrepreneurship. And this fifth layer is the scale to enterprise. This is the retention and expansion layer. Reaching scale, retaining these companies is different than building them. It requires talent, it requires corporate connectivity, and those things truly matter in this level. And the infrastructure at this stage is really regional competitiveness, things like housing and schools and transit and cultural density and a critical mass of other scaled companies creating kind of a talent market and fluidity in that talent market. You can't build all of this with programming alone. Programming creates the entry points, infrastructure creates the pathways, and most ecosystems are full of entry points and empty on the pathway side of this. Just to kind of bring this, just to kind of wrap this part of the conversation up, I want to go back to that Enrico Moretti multiplier that we kind of started with and that's talked about in the essay. Um, One innovation economy job means that there are 5 other jobs created, and 3 of those are typically without degrees. So this isn't about choosing startups over small businesses. It's about recognizing that, high growth entrepreneurship serves a different function in a regional economy. And right now, most regions have no deliberate infrastructure for it, whether it's political reasons, whether it's kind of misappropriation of social levers and layers versus the economic impacts. Um, Most regions miss out on this level of investment and creating this infrastructure in the right way. And the problem with that is we're leaving growth on the table. And the people who pay the highest price, they aren't necessarily the founders. They're the workers in every other sector who would have benefited from the multiplier effect of companies that never got built, that never grew the regional economy, and that didn't create the opportunity for a stronger local economy that could support small business. So if you want to know, if you want to understand kind of where this stemmed from, and I do have the essay that I wrote. It's on Substack. It's also on my LinkedIn. It's called "Every Startup Is a Headquarters," um, and I think it'll help set up kind of where we're headed in this conversation, and one of the things that we want to talk about next, which is what does the other side of this equation look like? What is the corporate side of corporate startup dynamics, and what's that conversation need to be to continue to develop this required infrastructure to support high growth entrepreneurship.